director with Fenestration Canada. We're going to be holding our tech talk this morning, looking at changes in the NBC. I'd like to thank OpenJanela for sponsoring this session for us today. My apologies to them. I couldn't bring up my background with their logo, but I'll make sure that's fixed for the next one. So guest today to talk about this change, this very significant change. I've got Dave Goldsmith from Cornerstone. Dave's the Tech Services Committee co-chair for Fenestration Canada. So Dave, thanks for being here. And I've got Anton Van Dyke from our friends over at Layton Consulting. Anton is a fenestration specialist helping the industry with Layton Consulting through many of the challenges they face today. So welcome, guys. Maybe just take a second to kind of tell us who you are, what you do, and then we'll get going. Dave, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I've been working for PlyGem, formerly Gino, now Cornerstone, for 33 years, and volunteering at Fenestration Canada and other places for over a decade now. So got a lot of experience under my belt from that. My journey started when the shit hit the fan with NAFS in BC, and it continued from there.
Okay, thanks, Anton.
Yeah, Anton Van Dyke. My background, actually, for those of you who don't know, comes from the building science leaky condo world, starting in the late 90s. Evolved through the whole progression of fixing that world, and then jumped into Windows in 2010, and right when NAFS came in. And so my kind of area I like to play in is compliance and what it takes to be compliant and how to meet code. So basically to avoid inspection failures has kind of been my sort of forte. So interpreting, I've learned that learning the code and interpreting the code has massive value in business strategy, sales strategy, marketing strategy. And I always like to say to people, I spend 1 week every 2 years sitting on my deck, reading the code front to back, so you don't have to. So we'll do our best to interpret the crazy language. And this one is a doozy. And I think it's going to be worth several conversations over the next little bit to figure out how to apply this to a manufacturer's strategy for compliance.
Yep, absolutely. Code interpretation. Boy, there's a mouthful. So Dave, why don't you take us through what's going on here?
Sure.
There's a change in the 2020 code that made the engineering path considerably more complicated for products under NAFS. So why don't you walk us through what that change is?
Okay, so basically under Part 5 of the code, you have applicable standards, and it refers to NAFS as the applicable standards for products that are covered under the scope of NAFS. And so one of the problems we've had in that in the past is people think then that NAFS testing covers you off for everything, and it doesn't, because on non-Part 9 buildings, you can require some engineering. Right now, the engineering leeway is pretty wide for what you can do. It's completely at the discretion of the engineer. And the reason for that is 5923, structural and environmental loads, air leakage, and water penetrations, says that windows, doors, skylights, and their components shall be designed and constructed with Article 5141, which is structural, Section 5.4, which is air leakage, and Section 5.6, which is water. Or 5922, which is just above here, when covered under the scope of NAFS. So this has traditionally been interpreted as the primary route that you can qualify even products that are covered under the scope of NAFS is by engineering in Part 5, particularly on non-Part 9 projects. And 592 is available for products which are covered under the scope of NAFS, should the engineer need to want to follow that route. NBC 2020, again, it's still got the same applicable standards, but now it says window, doors, skylights, and their components shall be designed and constructed in accordance with those previous sections where they are not covered under the scope of NAFS, and Article 5922 where they are covered in the scope of NAFS. And so that's going to be a big change, and this was made in NBC 2020, and the standing committee thought that this was actually the correct interpretation all along, going back to when this language first went in 2010, and they felt that this was just an editorial change to clarify the already existing intent, but it caught us a little bit by surprise because it was not didn't go out for public review.
So that item B really is the line that makes all the difference, right? I mean, 5922, where they are covered in the scope, right?
Yeah,
So,
and you can only use part 5 where they are not covered in the
yeah,
scope.
so
And
those
so
two
that
lines really
maximum
hurt.
leeway has gone away for an engineer.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So now you have to reference NAVs, and it's not 100%. We've been improving NAVs over the years, right? And there's reference standards in NAVs, AMA 450 and AMA 2502. And until AMA 450-20 and NAVS 22, they did not provide complete guidance on how to qualify both composite units and combination assemblies using NAVs without having to fully test the combination assemblies. So if you want, I can go to that. And so here is what the current mullion rating section of NAV 17 says. And so it implies that you can use AMA 450 for mullion ratings for both composite units or mold combination assemblies. And but then if you go into AMA 450 prior to 2020, it's very clear that the scope of that standard only applies to combination assemblies, not composite units. And just to back up a little bit and clarify, combination assembly is 2 separate window boxes that you mull in the conventional sense with mull couplers and sealant. And a composite unit is a continuous exterior frame with an intermediate member, such as a T-bar spanning the width of that composite unit. So what the current language says is composite units that utilize integral mullions within a single frame, they shall be tested as a complete unit according to the provisions of the appropriate clauses of this standard specification. And then they give you a little bit of a loophole here. Testing shall be in accordance with clause 12.3.6, or the composite unit shall be reviewed by a qualified engineer. However, there's no guidance given in any of the reference standards to help that qualified engineer determine how they should review that unit. And so that has been cleared up with NAVS 22 and AMA 450-20. However, it's not used in practice yet, because most testing agencies, they don't completely qualify every possible configuration in the manufacturer's catalog. You know,
yeah,
and so
the rub there is that NBC 2020 does not reference NAFS 22 or AMA 450-20.
Yeah.
Right. So that kind of holds you up, that you technically those are not paths that you can follow. Right.
Yeah.
Under
technically, because they're not adopted yet. However, again, you can see this terminology here: the composite unit shall be reviewed by a qualified engineer. Technically, you can go ahead and do that, but then what documentation is required? That's going to be a big dispute. You know, yeah. When a building owner or another engineer who's challenging the air water structural aspects of the products, and quite frequently when you have signed and sealed shop drawings, you know, you've got the building envelope engineer. They look at the integration of the building envelope, and another engineer looks at the structural attributes of the units, including wind loads and guard loads and deflection and anchorage. But nobody as an engineer is signing off on that unit in terms of the air and the water attributes. And that's a big hole if the manufacturer doesn't have test results for that. And I'll give you an example. We had a project where we had a slider that was tested as a standalone slider to 330 pascals water resistance. Customer ordered a 9-light, 2.5 meter tall window, and it was not able to achieve 330 pascals in field water testing because it's got a waterfall coming down the face from the units above, and that condition was not tested in the laboratory. So, you know, then we got into a dispute that your water rating on your label says 330, and we field tested it, didn't make 330, right?
So that's a perfect example of kind of historically what manufacturers have done. So Anton, why don't you walk us through what's been going on in the last 10 or 15 years when manufacturers rely on trying to use an engineering path for products that are not actually lab tested in those designs?
Yeah, there's a lot of history I think we can rely upon. In British Columbia, if I go back 25 years before NAFS even occurred, like the leaky condo issues really triggered a response in defining professional obligations. You know, you had a lot of litigation coming out of leaky condos. There was a lot of water testing done of windows that were 5 years old on existing buildings. So it created a system in place that I think really has tested the time and has been really effective. These changes have, you know, in a roundabout way, they're starting to align with that, but they're starting to also sort of poke at some of those systems that have been effective. And so it causes a bit of an aggravation as to what does this mean for me? I've been doing this for 10 years, 20 years. You know, how do I, you know, adjust this? So if I take the part 5 path and back up, so Dave, maybe you can go to the 2020 NBC sort of portion here. If you think of when part 9 triggers you to go to part 5, if you choose that path, we're 974. What is it? Sorry, just try to cite this. 9731 in the 2020 National Code gives you a path to use NAFS or use part 5. So yeah, scroll down just a little bit to number 5 here, right there. So that or, see where it says, so 974, 975, 976, or part 5. That or kind of gave a lot of flexibility to manufacturers to basically not have to test in reality. And I know in British Columbia, when NAFS sort of came into the code in 2012, 2013, I believe the initial language in part 9 was product had to be tested in accordance with NAFS. And there was a revision that changed the language to designed and constructed in accordance with NAFS. And so that change helped clarify a few things, which opened the door, because AMA 450 is contained in the NAFS standard. AMA 450 is not a code standard. So if a manufacturer chooses to use AMA 450 as a compliance tool within the NAFS standard, in conjunction with testing, is generally how I've experienced AMA 450 used to a certain extent. Because in my time working with engineers, and in particular envelope consultants, when you ask how to engineer air and water tightness, you can kind of get a little bit of a head scratching sometimes going, there's no defined process for this. And I can assure you, most envelope consultants that work in the world of, you know, water tightness, air tightness, they're going to rely on a certain extent of testing to demonstrate a product's ability to perform appropriately. Now, that can vary widely in how you go about it. And so I talked to actually another engineer a couple months ago about this particular issue for single family homes. And he does gets involved in a lot of custom homes. He's an energy advisor as well. And, you know, he will use the overall building design as justification for how do deal with air and water tightness. So Dave, go back to the 2020 NBC portion, part 5. The previous one. Oh, you got to go find it. Where I think the 5.4 and the 5.6 section of part 5 is really where we start to see how the engineering process sort of comes in. And I've seen some engineers, for example, on doors, they'll basically say, well, the door is under, you know, 20 feet of overhang, or the window has got a 5-foot overhang. It's never going to get wet. I can use that as justification in a roundabout way through an engineering concept. And really whereas some engineers might say, well, the window itself just has to meet a water rating in order to comply with these parts of the code. And so there's been this sort of kind of unwritten sort of process on how to apply 5.4 and 5.6, the air leakage and the water rating component of the 5.4 into an engineering process. And I've been trying to dig into at the BC code level, because there's still a part 5 path in British Columbia. British Columbia has not adopted the national code yet. And so it still has an allowance in part 9 to take you to part 5 and then use the whole section of part 5 for your compliance. And I was trying to determine whether or not BC was going to adopt this in the future. And of course, I can't get an answer because they probably can't answer it because they probably don't know yet. But one of the things that has sort of come out of the conversation is there's a lack of engineering process, clearly defined process for this part 5 of the code. And if you compare it to other sections of the code that, you know, especially from part 9 that triggers an engineer, So that would be like a railing design, truss design, where part 9 takes you to part 4. There's clear definitions of letters of assurance that go along with it. So there's a sort of understanding of what does it mean to use part 5 as part of your compliance strategy. Well, it really depends on your relationship with an engineer and the ability of a group potentially of engineers. Like Dave, you mentioned, you'll get a structural engineer doing the structural and an envelope consultant doing the water. Now you might get an energy advisor doing the air tightness. So the part 5 process in a roundabout way has become really complex, almost more complex than testing can be. The challenge that I've had in British Columbia is the part 5 path is used a lot as we failed inspection. You get a phone call going, the building inspector wants a NAFS letter. Well, what the heck is a NAFS letter? Or they want a part 5 letter. What the heck is a part 5 letter? I recently had an email from an inspector from City of Burnaby, and I would take the City of Burnaby as probably having the most stringent enforcement regimen in all of Canada when it comes to NAFS. They're the most educated inspectors on this topic, where they're basically a product showed up with a label on it that the product was bigger than the label and it failed inspection. And the building official basically said to have it engineered to part 5, but also do field testing, which was a new one that I had seen. I had not seen a building official actually push for, in order to confirm 5.4 and 5.6, they were basically asking for testing to be done. So the challenge with the part 5 path is with lack of clarity of how the engineering process should be done, it's left up to the engineer who's been hired to basically determine what they can and can't do. And you've got a wide variety of perspective there. So
yeah, and you can see how permissive the section on precipitation is. It's very permissive. It says, except as provided in sentence 2, where a building component or assembly is exposed to precipitation, the component or assembly shall minimize ingress of precipitation into the component or assembly and prevent ingress of precipitation into interior space. That's a lot less strict than A440S1 failure criteria for windows.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then they say, you don't have to protect it if it's a building that it doesn't adversely affect the health or safety of building users, the intended use of the building, or the operation of building services. So if you had cows in there, let the water come in, I guess, right?
What I find interesting, to separate AMA 450 and Part 5 as they're similar but they're different, and I think they get misunderstood as being the same thing. Part 5 is a code path. AMA 450 is a path within the NAF standard, which then is a code path.
Yeah.
So in theory, if I were to interpret that, you could label a product that has been engineered structurally and tested for air and water that meets the intent of AMA 450 and label it as you would normally label it as if it was 100% tested, in my opinion.
That's what manufacturers have been doing quietly in the background.
Yeah,
because nobody's been challenging it.
For sure. So you have a handful of test reports on one of your Windows systems with a wide variety of configurations. You've got air and water on that system. Now you are going to build something larger. You have an engineer deal with the structural and sign off on that.
Yep.
That water and air testing that you have, how legitimate is that? And that gets really gray and really complicated. Dave, you shared a perfect example where you could have a system where the slider's on top and it may never be an issue, or the slider's on the bottom with a great big waterfall above it. So it gets really difficult to be able to quantify and prove that your air water testing.
And that's what AMA 450, the new language in AMA 450.20 is trying to do, but it's actually very permissive if you look at it. It says that it's up to the engineer so it tells you how to do the structural, because that's easy. You can tell somebody how to do structural calculations. But for the air water, you do need to, on composite units anyways, on combination assemblies, you can still slap them together and they'll say this individual has this water and the mullion, provided the workmanship is good, the mullion's not going to leak. This window has the same as an individual. And no, that's not totally correct. right, for various reasons. So what we've done in AMA 45020, we bring both of them under the same roof, and we say you need additional testing. Okay, and it's up to the engineer to select the most critical condition and test for that. Right. And so what does that mean? There's no consensus because nobody's using the standard yet. It's been published for 4 years now. But the demand is not there for testing laboratories to say, I need you to I need you to get to certify. Basically, it's to empower a certification program under AMA, right?
Okay, yeah.
Where you have a letter that says that you can group products and you can say that this covers that and such and so forth. And then now you can have a 9-light unit, and the casement could be in any of the corners or in the middle or whatever, in the awning or whatever, that type of stuff, right?
I mean,
but the test labs have not dug into it deep enough and drilled down to say, so they need to start actually doing this testing, I think.
Yeah. My experience going that path was, if I had a challenge, was that here's my engineer's approval on the structural. Here's my 4 test reports from this Windows system that gets these kinds of ratings. And I was mostly successful, rarely ever challenged on that. So, I mean, that's kind of what's going on today. But in reality, what engineer is going to sign off on your air and water numbers for a configuration that's different than what you've tested? I've never seen that happen.
No, you're right, and that's going to be a sticky wicket. The best practice out there, if the manufacturer has not tested that particular configuration, is to say that you need a mock-up of the critical configuration on this project, right? Which one do you think is the most likely to cause the trouble? It's the 9-light that has the largest lights in it and the greatest span and all of that type stuff, and the sashes at the bottom. And then so really you would need to demonstrate it by, say, let's do field water testing on the mock-up before you order any windows, right? That's the critical part. Right. So it'd be unfair to the manufacturer. Like, here's what typically happens. They order something, right? They get the sign and sealed shops. When the penny drops that these configurations don't have NAFS test reports, the building envelope engineer will say, well, I'm not accepting this because you don't have the NAFS test reports. And, if the windows leak, that's kind of like a building envelope leak. And then you get into this kind of headbutting situation. The solution, obviously, is to say, listen, Mr. Building Envelope Engineer, you're going to be doing a mock-up anyways, right? To test the installation. So do a mock-up of the worst window and test the installation and the window, and do it before you order any windows. Don't come back later, when the project is substantially complete and they're putting the final windows in the 5th floor or whatever, and start hosing down the ground floor windows at 330 pascals. And saying that the NAVS rated rating of 330 is a contract with the company that they're going to field water test at exactly that. And some manufacturers downgrade their ratings.
Yeah,
we just designed and tested a new triple glaze slider. It came in at 440, and we were happy. But then we're like, we're not going to label this. Not going to label this at 440. What will we label it at, boys?
Yeah, exactly. You better be awfully confident that 9-light bottom slider is going to do what you say it's going to do, right?
Yeah.
So that's a challenge.
Well, probably labeled it at 330.
Yeah, exactly. I do want to come back to your comment that in your discussion with BC, Fenestration Canada raised this item with the folks at the Building Standards branch when we first saw it. They were good about jumping on it to get an understanding of what was in the NBC. And at that time, they did decide that they would not adopt this new language. So they are carrying forward with, the path that we're all familiar with. Whether it's being done right or wrong is somewhat irrelevant at this point. But I don't know of other jurisdictions right now that are doing the same. We have raised this point, but BC status quo for now, we believe. What does this look like for 2025 as the new changes come down?
Yeah, so they confirmed in the 2024 is coming out. They're not changing it in the 2024 BC. It's going to stay the same, allow the Part 5 path. And I believe it's because BC has done a really good job at somewhat defining how the Part 5 path is used, in particular to Part 3 buildings. Your 6-story wood frames, your 3-story townhomes, the multifamily sector has a very, very well-defined focus of accountability and responsibility for professional design when we're dealing with engineered shop drawings. I think the part that I see in BC that's going to be the evolution is the single family market, which who knows if there's much of a future left with the single family market. And everything's going to go to fourplexes and sixplexes anyway. So this might be a moot point at the end of the day, where manufacturers probably have to start recognizing the fact that your clients are going to be like building fourplexes to sixplexes, which will have warranty insurance, which will have all of this new regulatory regimes that are going to come and prepare for that moment of shift. But I think the important part here is, if I look at what was established for Part 3 buildings in BC and what Dave's talking about with mock-ups and engineered shop drawings, it's not done in every region. I know in Alberta, it's not common to do shop drawings for townhomes, 3-story townhomes, but it's very common to do them in British Columbia.
And I find mock-ups are really uncommon.
Yeah.
And the other thing, it says in every scope of work, they want mock-ups and samples. It's standard boilerplate language in there.
Yeah.
So they can come back at you later and say, why did you not submit mock-ups for building owner and consultant review? The language is in there, but then they don't order the mock-ups.
The risk with all of what I find with this is it's a very reactive approach to compliance. And so what I actually like about the AMA 450 approach, and this is something I personally, when I got into the window industry right in 2011, 2012, right when NAFS was dropping in BC in the 2012 BC. And for those of you that were in this, you remember that time very well. It got delayed to 2013. The code language got changed and got modified and updated to make it work. For about 2 or 3 years, there was a lot of progression made on how to do it. What I actually like about this and the use of AMA 450 as opposed to Part 5 is it requires a manufacturer to spend some time up front pre-engineering, pre-designing, pre-strategizing their compliance strategy, as opposed to let's do 5 tests, maybe 10 tests, and hope we're good. And then we don't have quite a test report to match, like the size is just not quite the same. So I'm going to put a label on a product and hope no one really looks. Where people get caught is you build a 14-foot by 9-foot window and you put a label on it that says 8 feet by 6 feet. Well, building officials are pretty smart. They're going to catch that. And then the response is use Part 5 to it's already installed. The stucco scratch coat might be on. You can't remove it. There's nothing you can do. Just get an engineered letter and we're all good. What AMA 450 allows you to do now is do all of that work you would do in reaction mode ahead of time. And it'll allow you to develop labels in a way that building officials will see a label and go, oh, it's good. So your relationship with, if you've been using Part 5 as your strategy, start looking at how to use AMA 450 as your strategy, and then you can focus on what do I need to do beforehand. And some manufacturers that I work with, they recognize when they're quoting a project, they go, oh, this window on this house is bigger than what we have for a label. They'll call us up 2 or 3 months before they have to ship product to site and say, can you provide us with an engineering solution for this? As opposed to we failed inspection. So just that's what I think the AMA 450 standard is going to do to help guide manufacturers on developing sort of compliance strategies ahead of time. The other part I kind of want to jump into, though, is BC, I think, is going to keep, this is my prediction, don't quote me on this, being recorded, so maybe it will, but I think BC will keep a Part 5 path forever, in my opinion, because BC has developed a very well-defined Part 5 path for Part 3 buildings because of how we reacted to the leaky condo business. We have a very, very well-identified system that for 3-story townhouses, multifamily, and higher buildings, engineered shop drawings are done where a structural engineer is hired to do the structural wind load deflection calculations, the guard load calculations, all of the safety glass specifications, and everything to meet that part of the code. We have a good building envelope industry where the building envelope consultants are looking at the 5.4 and 5.6. We now have energy advisors involved in projects doing whole building air testing. So we actually have good systems in place, and every multifamily project in British Columbia has got a ASTM E1105 field test done on it. So there's actually the systems in place to use Part 5 correctly in British Columbia exist. in multifamily, not in single family. And this is why we're starting to see building officials in cities like Burnaby basically saying you need to test for air and water for a single family home. So, you need to start accounting for that. And the challenge a manufacturer is going to have is if you're using Part 5 as a reaction to compliance, it's like, how do you price that into your quotes? How do you plan for that? What do you do? And what does that look like? So I think it's using models that exist, that have worked, I think are sort of a first step in this whole process that that is being defined.
Mm.
Okay. So let's set BC aside for a minute, because I agree that, we're probably a little further along this path than a lot of areas across the country. Plus, they've opted to not adopt this change. So Dave, NBC 2020 comes down. Most regions across the country are adopting sometime in the next few months, a couple maybe towards the end of this year. So I'm a manufacturer. This thing lands on my desk, NBC 2020. It says that I can no longer engineer. I need to follow NAFS. What am I doing? What's my plan
Well,
now
so
moving
we're
forward?
we're we're not fully ready to play the game until NBC 2025, when NAFS 22 and AMA 45020 are in there. NBC 2020 does not refer to 45020, and certainly
Right.
doesn't refer to NAFS 23. So if somebody is to challenge your work, you can point to testing shall be in accordance with clause 12.3.6, or the composite unit shall be reviewed by a qualified engineer. What does that look like? So you could start off by saying, here's the engineering that we're doing today. We do the structural AMA 450 calculations, and also AMA 2502 contains how to do those calculations. And this is how we validate the structure of the window for a deflection standpoint, and for an end connection type standpoint. You could even have a finite element analysis software if you're that sophisticated. So now you've done the structural. So now the open question is the air water, right? And that's where it's not really defined. And then the other thing, so we were challenged actually on this project that I was mentioning. I said, well, I reviewed the composite units, right? So we had problems on a project where they said these 6 light units and 9 night units are not code compliant because you don't have NAFS test reports. It was because of a different situation, but that's the legal argument somebody's going to pick, right? They'll go into NAFS, they'll dig around in there, they'll say you're supposed to be tested in conformance with clause 12.3.6, which is very limiting, or reviewed by an engineer. Well, where's your documentation, Mr. Engineer? Oh no, I got the ring of power here, and that type of thing. It's hard to argue, in an arbitration about that, and so you're quite vulnerable. So what you could do is you go to AMA 45020, and now it does have a section at the very end on the submittal package, and it's pretty complete. And so it's actually probably more than a lot of engineers who are doing their own designs might want to do, because again, this whole AMA system that was set up was for people who are certifying their NAFS test results under AMA, and before that, their AMA test results under AMA, right? And so these documentations have grown over the years, and the idea always was you go hat in hand to the testing and certification agencies, and you say, I need you guys to test a bunch of windows and write a bunch of reports. Please do me a big favor and try to test as little as possible, right, to support your reports. And then they give you these formal reports that you can then file that says, this third-party engineer has now grouped all my product, and there's grouping rules in here. So they've had grouping rules for a long time in here, where they talk about grouping of multiple designs for qualification by a single evaluation. And so it was always very clear how you group for structural, right? Like, so if so they went as far as to say, you got a double hung on this side, and the sashes are not adding any to the structure, and you got a fixed sash on this side. And so that's one group. But what you could do is you can find your weakest mullion, right, and group your stronger ones with them. So they made it clear that you could do that kind of grouping. So you don't have to test every possible fixed sash, double hung, slider beside the mullion, right? You could group them. So we also tried to do that for air and water, but we weren't able to, give them diagrams in the appendix to say how this is going to work. We just said grouping for the purposes of air and water performance may be different than the grouping for structural performance. An AMA accredited laboratory, it's an AMA standard, right? Or a licensed design professional shall review all mold fenestration systems within manufacturer's specified grouping in order to determine the weakest and or minimal performing product, and et cetera, et cetera. And so this is where, and we had many meetings when we were creating this. I actually co-chaired the task group that was trying to do this, and we had people coming in and out, new people, old people leaving. And we fought a big fight because they were trying to say, okay, let's give us some examples, right? And so we fought back against that, because we said, then you're going to handcuff the engineer, right? Because you have to trust the engineer. This is a document that is intended to be used by engineers, right? In good conscience, right? And they're going to think of something that you didn't think of, right? And because the thing they thought of is not an example in your document, people will say, well, that's not a valid method. So we left the barn door pretty much wide open. Okay, and this is the clause in there that we're going to have to, as an industry, come together and basically say what your best and worst case scenarios are. I did the slider as an example, right? We never anticipated that. Perhaps a casement, or compression sealing products. I mean, they shouldn't really leak. It's either they leak or they don't leak, right? If the compression seal is working well, then they're not going to leak, whether they're at the bottom or the top or the middle. It's the sliders where things get a little bit crazy. And then the other thing, of course, let's say you had a slider where the slider, when the slider is below, right, it drains into a sill member. If the slider is above, it drains into an intermediate member. If that drainage system is different than your sill drainage system, you need to also qualify that drainage system. It might be better than even, or not worse than the bottom, right? You can come up with something clever, to give it a higher head.
But again, this is 20. How much of this language is in 10? Because 10 is going to be the standard we need to point to at least until 2025.
So the only problem with 10 is it makes it clear that it does not apply to composite units. So if I go, sorry, you're going to have to bear with me here. I'm going to have to find 10. But even the title of 10 makes it clear that this is for combination assemblies.
Right.
So the original concept under AMA 450, and it was not a really fair concept, was that you can treat the mullion completely separately because it doesn't affect the performance of the individual units, and we test those separately. That's not really true, right? That was like a big concession to combine combination assemblies. And combination assemblies, there are a lot of people out there like the window installation standard now says for combination assemblies you need sill flashing, right? Because they know they leak. Right. So what's the superior product from the terms of potential leakage? Well, it's the composite unit, right? Because you've only got the end joints to worry about. You don't have to worry about the seam between the two. Yes, the composite units. So the combination have a seam if you're working chips or somewhere along that seam.
So I just want to try and make sure that our people that are watching us understand that under NBC 2020, if it's adopted as these clauses are written, you can use AMA 450-10 and NAFS 17 to qualify combination assemblies with engineering. That still is a path that's wide open.
That path always existed for combination.
So that's
assemblies.
not changed.
That's not changed.
So even though the language points to you must use NAFS, NAFS allows you to use AMA 450-10 to qualify combination units. So nothing's changed for that product.
If the only types of assemblies that you make are combination assemblies, you're laughing because
nothing's changed as long as you're doing that, right?
Because it was very permissive,
right?
And so it basically said for combination assemblies that you test as combination assemblies or individual units with mullion performance tested separately or calculated in accordance with AMA 450. And AMA 45010 said, you know, for your water testing of your mullion, you could like poly off the casement and the direct set beside it and just
test those
spray water on the
yes.
mullion by itself, and that can qualify the mullion, where it becomes a lot more of a complicated thing with composite units, because those intermediate member, a T-bar, may be very different structurally and in the way
Yes,
it performs
for sure.
than two frames that are mulled back to back, right? Might be very different, particularly if you've got drainage systems in that intermediate member, right?
Okay, so you're a manufacturer building combination systems. As long as you have done your testing to meet air and water of those mulled systems, you can use AMA 450 to engineer structurally and rely on those air and water tests to get you to where you need to be.
Yeah.
Okay, so under 2020, I'm a manufacturer building composite units. What's my path once 2020 lands?
Well, 2020 still reversed to 17, and so you've got this back door that I was showing you a minute ago there, where it says or the testing shall be in accordance with 1236, or the composite unit shall be reviewed by a qualified engineer. Now, 1236, we can go to that, right? So it's saying example D qualifies A or B, and it qualifies, et cetera, but it's giving you a very limited number of examples, you know, and you're still going to have to test a lot of these units, you know, and they're nowhere near as complex as project windows, right? So if you want to go this route, yeah, then you practically have to test almost all of these, right? Say
so
E
I'm a
qualifies A, C, or E,
manufacturer,
but not B or D, you know?
so I'm a manufacturer that's building composite designs. I have a handful of test reports for structural and air and water, but I'm going to build bigger than that. My engineer is going to design and approve my structural design. Where's the responsibility now for the air and water of that composite design? Because the engineer is not approving, or are they, my air and water based on?
So I would say, so if you have an internal water testing lab, like we don't have a full test lab here in Calgary, but we have a water testing lab, but it's limited on the size that you can put products in there, and we do quality control testing. We can't fit the very largest ones in there, so it's a bit of an open question, and we got stung on the very largest sliding patio doors at one point. So we just took a rain rack and tested them like in the car wash area type of deal, right?
Yeah.
You know, so to get a more realistic idea, you know, of what's going on, you can do this internal testing, you know, and say that that satisfies you for your internal purposes. After all, if you are not a part of a certification program, you are basically self-certifying. You're under the honor system, right? You're saying, based on our experience, we think this is what the performance will be. We've got all this product in the field, that we're not getting issues of leaking under real world conditions. But the moment they hit it with ASTM 1105 conditions without telling you, you know, then you have unexpected results.
I want to touch on the certification, because that, you know, for me, that you know, I always wrestle with, is certification a good or a bad thing? If I'm building products, composite designs, let's use those as an example, and you know, I've built a 6-light window that is in a certification program, and now I build a 9-light. It's not in that certification program if it's larger, or, I mean,
so
where's my limitations, and who's backing me up?
It's how conservative the test lab is. Okay, so we've given the test lab new tools under AMA 45020 when that comes into effect. Right. Okay. They could choose to be as conservative as they've always been, right, and not use those tools, or they can open up their toolbox and start messing around. And that's where we have, as an industry, you know, with field water testing and laboratory testing, you know, we need to explore this gray area, because it's not even just it's a dark room you're opening the door into, and it's pitch black in there right now.
And I want to open that door to Anton, because BC, we kind of have a process. It seems to be working. What do you foresee you're going to be getting calls from people outside of BC asking, what do I do with this? What are you going to recommend?
Yeah, if I use the Part 9 townhome complex multifamily regiment that's in BC used all the time, what I recognized early with this process about a decade ago was if I tested the largest product we could make for air and water only, basically governed by what could fit on a truck without hitting an overpass for height.
And they do that a lot in BC, don't they?
Same one company does it a lot.
Yes, indeed.
And then for maximum width, it kind of came down to how big could you put a product into a test booth. And I tested that. We just built these really massive configurations of multi-light things and did air and water testing only to really experiment and play around with what could the product do. It was an internal thing. It was, NAFS changed everything by putting the size tested beside the performance grade, which is the transition from CSA A440 to NAFS really amplified the importance of you can't just test something small and qualify everything like everybody used to do with the old A, B, and C rating.
For sure, yeah.
So it changed the whole mindset. And then I talked to structural engineers about, how do you define deflection and deal with all this and deal with structural loads, and I want everything to be at a PG 40 rating possibly, and how big can I go to hit PG 40, how small, if I want to go to PG 55, how big can I get, all the different kind of concepts. So this was a lot of behind the scenes work, and the reason why I did that is because I knew I had to convince architects and envelope consultants to specify the product. It wasn't about code compliance anymore at that stage. It was, how do I convince them that the product won't leak, that it'll be airtight, and it won't deflect? And they basically all said to me, I want to see your testing. And I knew there was no way I was going to go into that market without sufficient volumes of testing. And it wasn't that I had to have everything tested, but it couldn't go to it with one report. I needed 5,
for sure,
10 reports in order to do it. And then,
and you mentioned in our pre-meeting that this is going to heavily affect foreign products being brought in that were never touched by NAFS.
So I actually posted this code change on my LinkedIn profile, and someone commented on, this is going to have an interesting impact on import product, because ALMA 450 is something you have to do as a manufacturer behind the scenes to get your pre-engineering. It's basically pre-engineering your product.
Right.
You're manufacturing in Asia, or you're manufacturing in Europe, and you're shipping to North America, and you don't have North American qualified engineers for the region. Like, this is the other part, is does it have to be a professional engineer from BC to do ALMA 450, for Alberta, for Ontario, for all the regions?
No, it actually is defined in there. In Canada, it's a professional engineer registered in Canada, and in the USA, it's a professional engineer registered in USA. But that's going to mean your Canadian results need to be reviewed by an engineer in the USA, or somebody who's dual licensed, right?
Current path that most import products take, if they haven't done, like in Asia, you've got some test, Intertech, I believe, has got a test lab in Asia, so they can use this stuff. A lot of the product landing here in our ports is coming here with the implication that we'll just use the Part 5 path for compliance. That's the path they're choosing to use. They're not choosing to do the tested path. Well, I'll back up. Some of them are doing their testing to European standards, and they're then expecting to get the equivalency. This changes that game completely, that there is no equivalency path to use anymore. And so, I'm having these conversations actually daily right now, because there's a lot of dealers that are bringing in really, really high performance product, really cool product that would have no problem meeting BC and Canadian North American codes, but administratively they don't. And so they're going to have to really step up, and some local manufacturers might actually see this as a good thing, because now import products have to go through all the regiments that local manufacturers have to go through. It's going to create a fair playing field, and that may be the motive behind this change. I don't know, but
I think it was at least it was
a big part of it. Yes, it was for sure.
So it really comes down to more testing. I hate to say it. The simplistic part of this change is, we've had 10 years of NAFS in our code to navigate and work it. My recommendation has always been you should be doing at least 5 to 10 NAFS tests in a lab a year if you're a local manufacturer, to keep up with what you need to keep your reports relevant, keep doing bigger, keep doing smaller. You've got changes to combustibility, so you can put vinyl and fiberglass 25 stories up now if you're not doing more testing for that market. The reality and the simplistic way to look at this is if you just need to do more testing. And, you know, you can't expect even the engineers, the more engineers I've been talking to with this change, it's created a hyper awareness as to, you know, when a building official says, or someone says, just give me a NAFS equivalency letter. And I go, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. What
And
is
they're
that?
going,
Yeah.
well, I want a letter that says the window meets NAFS. And I go, okay, do you know what that means? No. Have you ever read the NAFS standard? No. Okay. So
Yeah.
you come back to me after you have, and then ask the question again, because you'll realize, oh shoot, I need to do more testing.
Yeah. So you do need to do more testing, but what we're really working hard is to try and minimize the testing. Honestly, my whole journey started in 2010 when it was going to come into effect in BC in 2012. And my boss said, hey, here's this new standard called NAFS, and read it and tell me how we can become in compliance with it. And I read it, and I'm like, there's no way that you can ever be compliant with this standard as it's written, and have a large offering of custom products. And so ever since then, I've been volunteering and working to try and make it so that gets clarified. And I think we've reached a really good point now with NAFS 22 and AMA 450 20. But it's still going to be a lot more testing than you have done if you want to have files that you could send to anybody and you're bulletproof, saying you don't comply with NAVs and we're suing you, right? You know, because we don't like your product for some other reason, so we're going to allege they don't comply with NAVs. You want to be able to slam that freaking dossier on the table and say, take a read of that.
And that's why I think you kind of go into this idea of like liability. I think we've all recognized that the standard is such a burden that you can't be 100% compliant. It's just too difficult.
Never.
We've all accepted that reality. And so that's the industry standard that's been created thus far. So how then do you protect yourself as a manufacturer as best as possible? And I keep saying it, look to BC. Look at how Part 9 townhomes are handled in British Columbia. That has stood the test of time. It's a 25-year, it's got a good 20-year history of a process. So if you choose a lower testing regimen as your strategy for compliance, you can do it still. It's just with the partnership of an architect. You have to have an architect you're working with who is accepting of the testing you've done. You have to have an engineer that you're working with that is accepting of the level of testing that you're done and willing to put, like, so an architect and the envelope consultant on a Part 9 townhouse complex is the envelope consultant signing off of the air and water tightness. The architect at the end of the day is doing the official letters of it. And there are letters of assurance that go with those engineered shop drawings. So it's just a matter of looking at systems that have been working and incorporating them into your strategy. If testing is something you don't want to do. But I would say, like, the number one step that I recommend every manufacturer do is test the largest combination product you can make for air and water. Because most engineers, if you ask them to provide a letter stating that this window will meet code for air and water without any type of testing to demonstrate it, you're going to have a tough time finding someone who can say that.
For sure.
Because there's no calculation formula like there is in structural engineering.
Oh, there isn't.
Yeah.
But the only thing I need to point out about AMA 450-20, if you're qualifying by calculation, and all of the AMA 450s have that, then you have to put a deflection limit on there. So if somebody says,
changes everything if you're in R and LC class products. We're getting close to time, and a couple things I just want to make sure we do. So NBC 2020, BC 2024, as these adopt, references NAFS 17. What if I've got a portfolio of NAFS 11 reports? Quickly. Any good?
Oh boy. Well, yeah. So there's been no major changes since NAFS 11. I mean, when we went from NAVS 08 to NAVS 11, they published a document saying what the changes were. And since then, they went merrily on the way to all of the newer NAVs, and there's not been huge changes that are going to change the intent. But I think it could be a problem. Absolutely.
Could be a problem. Okay, I just want to open it up again. We're almost out of time.
One comment on that. Talk to the labs, because most labs, you talk to your lab about your reports and see if there's equivalencies or if there's ways they can adopt more.
Will they amend your report to cover 17? Yeah, okay.
Well, I'll tell you what happens though. They'll say, if your report's more than 5 years old, I'm not going to amend it.
people need to be looking at their reports and talking to their labs for sure. Any questions? Anybody out there that has a question that we can address quickly? We've only got a couple of minutes. NAFS 17
Must have been a
requires
really
AMA
good session.
910 to be used. Dave?
Where,
you
sorry,
know?
what? Who is what?
NAFS 17 requires AMA 910. Yes or no?
AMA 910?
I don't know AMA 910 off
No,
the
I
top of my
don't
head.
know.
So
I don't know. No. I'm a 2502 and I'm a 450.
this presentation will be on our website and on our YouTube channel within the next few days.
Awesome.
Okay, so with that, hang on a sec, I gotta get out of that. Yes. Yes. No. Can't chat, so I'll email you. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Great presentation. Thank you. Okay, so really quickly, I want to thank OpenJanela software for sponsoring the Tech Talk sessions. Really appreciate those guys. Dave and Anton, great stuff. I love having you guys on. You're great supporters of FenCan. We really love working with you. Glazing Conference coming up April the 9th at the Civic Hotel in Surrey. Check out our website for the content there. It's going to be a great event. I want to congratulate Jeff Schellert over at Guardian Glass. He just joined the Fenestration Canada Board of Directors. It's going to be great having somebody from the commercial world representing the commercial industry on our association. And the spring conference coming up the end of May in Kananaskis, Alberta, working on the educational content. It's going to be a great event. You want to be there. So thank you very much, guys. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And tomorrow, we're going to be talking to the folks at Energy Star about the participant agreement. If you haven't signed up for that, jump to our website and get in on that one. Thanks a bunch, guys. Appreciate your time.
Bye, guys.
Yep.